Before there was history, there were legends. They tell you the sword was a miracle, a clean answer in a dirty world. A single moment so perfect it could silence every argument and end every feud. They tell you a young man reached for the impossible and the impossible yielded, as if destiny had been waiting patiently for the right hands to arrive. But the oldest shape of this legend doesn't begin with celebration. It begins with fear. A kingdom that has forgotten what certainty feels like. A land where power is scattered like broken glass, and every noble house carries a private hunger. A land where the crown is not an honor, but a target that draws steel the way blood draws wolves. And in that world, even good men begin to speak in careful tones, because careful tones are how you survive when the wrong word can become the spark of a war. So people pray for a sign, not a speech, not a counsel, not another promise that can be broken by sunrise. They pray for something so undeniable that politics can corrupt it, something the world itself seems to approve. And that is why the blade matters, not because it can cut, but because it can judge. Welcome, seeker of legends. Tonight, we follow the sword that doesn't merely win battles. It tests hearts. It exposes ambition. It measures restraint. And it leaves one question behind wherever it goes. What if the sword never chose a king? What if it chose a sacrifice? The version most people know is bright, almost simple, the kind of legend that sounds like sunlight in a hall of banners. A kingdom collapses into uncertainty. A crowd gathers. A sword stands trapped where no sword should exist, fixed in stone, waiting like a verdict. One by one, men try to pull it free. Strong men, proud men, men with loud names and sharp eyes. None succeed. Then a young man steps forward, unremarkable at first glance, and the impossible happens. The blade comes free as if the world itself exhales. And in that moment, the legend declares that legitimacy has been solved. The kingdom has its king. Then come the shining chapters, a united realm, a court of sworn knights, a table designed to tame pride, a ruler who pulls a nation away from the edge. The story promises that one impossible moment can heal a broken land, as if order can be forged in a single strike, the way a sword is forged. But legends don't survive because they comfort us. They survive because they warn us. And the deeper you listen, the more you realize the sword is not the happy ending. It's the ignition, the beginning of pressure, the start of a merciless examination of what power does to a human being when everyone around him expects a myth to walk and speak like a man. Because the moment a kingdom believes a symbol has chosen its ruler, the ruler is no longer allowed to be human. And that is where the test truly begins. In some tellings, the sword appears like a miracle that arrives to fix a broken country. But if you want the legend's true temperature, you must imagine the land before the miracle. Not a kingdom with neat borders and stable laws. A patchwork of loyalties. A territory stitched together by fear and old grudges. The old empire is gone. The old roads still exist, but they no longer guarantee safety. The old order left behind its bones, stone walls, collapsed forts, half-remembered titles, and men with hungry eyes step into the gaps, calling themselves protectors while collecting power like tax. When a land loses its center, everything becomes local. Justice becomes the mood of the nearest strong man. Truth becomes a rumor that changes as it travels. And peace becomes something people talk about the way they talk about summer, brief, unreliable, and never promised. This is why the legend does not begin with a parade. It begins with a crowd. A crowd gathers because crowds gather when they are desperate. When people cannot agree on words, they seek an object. When they cannot trust each other's promises, they ask the world to speak instead. They want a sign that does not argue back. So the sword is planted in the most public way possible, a challenge that cannot be negotiated in private. A verdict set where everyone can witness the failure of the proud. The blade becomes a courtroom without judges, because the stone does not care who you are. And notice the cruel beauty of the setup. The sword does not simply give a king. It forces every would-be king to kneel before something he cannot command. It forces the ambitious to reveal themselves. One by one, they try. And each failure teaches the crowd the same lesson. Power is common. Strength is common. But legitimacy, true legitimacy, is rare. That is why the sword becomes more than steel. It becomes the kingdom's last hope that the universe has standards. And once people believe the universe has standards, they will demand that the man who passes the test becomes the standard himself. Which means the real miracle is not the sword coming free. The real miracle would be a human being surviving what comes next. To understand why a blade could become destiny, you have to step into the kind of world that needs destiny in the first place. Imagine a land where law is a rumor that changes from valley to valley, where loyalty is currency, and the price rises whenever the throne weakens, where people don't argue about what is right, they argue about what they can enforce. In such a world, peace is not a natural state, it is a brief pause between storms. When leadership collapses, uncertainty spreads like smoke, not as a philosophical idea, but as behavior. People stop traveling alone. Merchants hire extra guards. Small disputes that once ended with words now end with bruises. Old grudges rise from the ground like bones. Everyone becomes a strategist, because in a kingdom with no center, survival becomes negotiation and negotiation becomes threat. That is why the legend introduces an object that can end debate. A sword in stone is not merely an image. It is a public sentence written into the world. It says, legitimacy is not negotiated, legitimacy is revealed. It says, no council can buy this decision, no army can bully it, no noble house can rewrite it with threats. It is a challenge that dares the ambitious to prove they deserve what they demand. Only one hand can draw the blade. And when the blade yields, it does more than crown a ruler. It rearranges the psychology of everyone watching. Because symbols are not passive. Symbols are gravity. They pull the ambitious closer. They make loyalty louder. They sharpen envy into something that can cut. And perhaps most dangerously, they allow frightened people to surrender responsibility. If the sword chose, then we didn't choose. If destiny decided, then we don't have to carry the guilt of supporting the wrong man. If fate speaks, humans can pretend they are only listening. That temptation is ancient. The legend knows it. It also knows another truth. People do not only want a king. They want a king who feels inevitable. A king whose legitimacy is so clean that even enemies hesitate before they swing. And in a fractured realm, hesitation is everything. So the sword becomes a public anchor. The crowd watches it the way sailors watch a lighthouse, not because the lighthouse is kind, but because it is reliable. A symbol offers reliability in a world that can't guarantee tomorrow. But reliability is not the same as goodness. A symbol can stabilize a kingdom and still ruin the person who carries it. Because the moment the sword becomes the anchor, the entire realm begins to orbit it. Noble houses reframe their loyalty not as love, but as alignment. Men who hated each other yesterday suddenly speak of unity today, because unity is the safest disguise when the crowd is watching. And behind the public stage, quieter conversations begin. If the sword can choose, then the sword can also be used. If the crowd believes the sword approves the king, then anyone standing close to the king can borrow that approval. Anyone whispering in the king's ear can pretend the sword whispered first. This is where the legend becomes sharper. It shows you that miracles do not remove politics. Miracles intensify politics. Some versions place a wizard behind the scene, a mind that understands crowds and fear the way a blacksmith understands metal. In the Arthurian world, that figure is often the one they call Merlin, not merely a sorcerer, but a strategist of belief. Because if you can control what people believe is sacred, you can guide a nation without moving an army. The sword in stone becomes a lesson in public psychology. It creates a single focus point large enough to drown 1,000 competing claims. It simplifies the argument. It makes the complicated clean. But there is a hidden danger inside any clean story. Reality is never clean for long. So imagine the day the blade finally yields. Not in the bright, polished version told to children, but in a hall full of adults who know how quickly a kingdom can burn. A young man steps forward, and the crowd's first reaction is not wonder. It is suspicion. Because in a frightened land, people do not trust miracles. They interrogate them. They look for tricks. They look for fraud. They look for hidden hands. A few men step closer, as if proximity might let them control what they are about to witness. Others hang back, because hanging back is how you survive if the crowd turns violent. Then the impossible happens. Steel slides free. And for one breathless heartbeat, the kingdom goes silent, not because everyone agrees, but because everyone realizes the rules of the game have changed. Because now the sword is not an object. It is an accusation. It accuses the proud of failing. It accuses the powerful of not being enough. It accuses the crowd of wanting certainty without paying for it. And the young man holding the blade feels the weight of thousands of eyes turning him into a story before he has spoken a word. That is the moment the trap closes. Because the blade did not merely reveal a king. It revealed a new kind of hunger, the hunger for a king who will never disappoint. This is why different tellings give the blade different entrances. Sometimes stone, hard, public, undeniable. Sometimes water, mysterious, ungraspable, older than human law. A lake is not a court. A lake does not vote. A lake does not bargain. A lake feels like nature, and nature feels older than kings. So when a hand rises from water holding the blade, the story is saying something quietly unsettling. Legitimacy does not belong to humans. Humans borrow it. Humans carry it for a while. Humans lose it when they forget what it costs. Different entrances, same hunger. People want certainty so badly they are willing to worship it. And once they worship it, the symbol begins to demand things back. Because the moment the sword becomes destiny, it creates a new kind of prison, expectation. People begin to demand that the king becomes worthy not as a man, but as a myth. They demand perfection. They demand victory. They demand righteousness. They demand that the king's heart never trembles. So when the chosen one steps forward, King Arthur, named by the impossible, he does not receive a gift. He inherits a trap. Because the moment the sword chooses him, it creates expectations no human can satisfy forever. And the myth is built to show what happens next. Here is the hidden rule beneath the legend, the rule whispered behind the shining banners. The sword does not choose the strongest. It chooses the one willing to be restrained. Because strength is easy to admire and hard to control. And the most dangerous thing in a fragile kingdom is not a weak ruler. It is a ruler who confuses power with permission. A ruler who believes the symbol exists to serve his desire rather than the realm's survival. So the myth creates a miracle that looks like a shortcut to stability. A single moment. A single proof. A single hand. But the real test is not in the pulling. The real test begins the day after. Because the day after, the king wakes up inside a cage made of expectation. The crowd that cheered now watches with narrowed eyes. The lords who bowed now measure every word. The allies who smiled now calculate what they can gain. The enemies who scoffed now look for cracks. The kingdom wants the chosen king to be a living guarantee. And the chosen king discovers something cruel. Being chosen doesn't make decisions easier. It makes them heavier. Every decision becomes a signal. Every hesitation becomes suspicious. Every compromise becomes proof of weakness. Every loss becomes proof destiny was wrong. And people hate destiny being wrong, because if destiny is wrong, responsibility returns to human hands. Then everyone must admit that they chose, that they followed, that they trusted the wrong sign, and that their trust could destroy them. So they cling harder to the symbol. They demand that the king never look uncertain. They demand that he never appear ordinary. They demand that he be the myth they paid for with their obedience. This is why the legend surrounds the reign with vows and codes, with ritual and structure. It places a great table at the center of the court not as decoration, but as an argument. The table says that no one sits above anyone else. The table says that pride must be flattened into a circle, because pride, left unchecked, turns kings into tyrants and knights into predators. Because the sword grants authority, but rules determine what authority becomes. And rules are painful, because rules limit desire. Rules prevent revenge. Rules force patience. Rules demand that the ruler becomes the first prisoner of the kingdom he leads. A king must obey the idea of kingship, even when his private heart begs for easier choices. So the sword becomes a contract written in steel. And every contract has a hidden clause. The hidden clause is simple. The king must become smaller than the symbol. He must serve the realm instead of serving himself. He must carry authority as a burden, not as a reward. He must understand that being chosen is not proof of deserving comfort. It is proof of owing something. Because the sword does not reward entitlement. It exposes it. It asks, again and again, in ways no ceremony can answer, will you use power to protect or to satisfy? Will you keep the oath when keeping it costs you? Will you hold the line when the line makes you lonely? And in that loneliness, the legend begins to breathe. Because it reveals the truth that the shining version of the story tries to hide. The chosen king is not tested by pulling a sword. He is tested by becoming the kind of person who does not need the sword to prove he deserves it. This is why the legend surrounds the reign with structure, codes, vows, rituals, public oaths, because a miracle without structure becomes chaos wearing a crown. And this is where the round table matters. Not as decoration, not as a romantic image, as a weapon against pride. In a normal court, a throne sits higher than the rest. That height is a constant reminder. Someone is above you. Someone matters more. Someone can demand obedience even when they are wrong. But the round table refuses that shape. A circle has no head. A circle has no best seat. A circle forces the powerful to pretend equality, even if equality is only an aspiration. And aspiration matters, because aspiration becomes behavior when enough people repeat it. So the table becomes a quiet argument against what kingdoms usually become. It says, strength must serve. It says, victory is not the same as justice. It says, the king is not a god. And for the king, that rule is both protection and punishment. Protection, because it reminds him he is not allowed to become a tyrant. Punishment, because it reminds him he is not allowed to become comfortable. The sword gave him authority, but the table forces him to share it. The sword made him special, but the vows force him to behave as if he is not. This is the deep secret under the legend's shining armor. The sword chooses a ruler, but the ruler must choose restraint every day afterward. Because a kingdom does not collapse only when enemies attack. A kingdom collapses when the king begins to treat power like permission. So the sword becomes a test with two blades. One blade cuts through doubt and unites the realm. The other blade cuts the ruler's private life into pieces, because the chosen king belongs to the kingdom now. And belonging to the kingdom means this: every desire becomes suspicious. Every friendship becomes political. Every moment of weakness becomes evidence. And evidence is what ambitious men collect. Every shining legend eventually fractures not because the story hates its hero, but because reality refuses perfection. The first fracture is not a battle. It is a whisper, because whispers are safer than swords. In a hall of banners, where knights swear loyalty and lords pretend agreement, the most dangerous thing is not an open enemy. The most dangerous thing is a man who smiles while measuring the king's mistakes like a merchant measuring coin. The sword created a moment of unity, but unity is fragile. Unity requires maintenance, and maintenance requires discipline. And discipline is exhausting, especially when every powerful house believes it deserves influence. So factions form like weather, quietly, inevitably. Some lords do not hate the king, they hate being excluded. Some do not doubt the sword, they doubt the boy who pulled it free. Some do not want the kingdom to fall, they want it to bend toward their interests. And because they cannot fight the symbol directly, they attack the man around it. They test him with impossible expectations. They demand victories that cannot be guaranteed. They demand justice that will offend someone no matter how it is served. They demand purity in a court full of compromise. A chosen king is not allowed to be good enough. He must be myth enough. So imagine the pressure of decision after decision. A border dispute that could become war. A famine that requires hard choices about who is fed first. A betrayal that demands punishment, but punishment creates enemies. A rival who kneels today but plots tomorrow. Every choice creates consequences, and consequences create stories. And stories shape loyalty, because courts do not run on truth. They run on the version of truth that spreads fastest. So the sword becomes a stage light that never turns off. It illuminates every flaw. It makes every mistake look like destiny crumbling. That is why the legend is haunted by rivalry and fracture. Not because the tale enjoys tragedy, but because the tale understands power. Power attracts the ambitious. Power attracts the fearful. Power attracts those who cannot survive in peace. And if you place a sacred symbol at the center of power, you create a single target that everyone will try to touch. If not with hands, then with influence, then with rumors, then with betrayal. A kingdom is not held together by one dramatic moment. It is held together by thousands of smaller choices. How you treat rivals when they are vulnerable. Whether you keep promises when keeping them costs you something. How you punish betrayal without becoming the monster your people feared. How you feed the hungry without empowering the greedy. How you respond to fear without feeding it. And once a king is crowned by a symbol, the court becomes a stage. Everyone performs. Loyalty becomes theater. Friendship becomes strategy. Love becomes political. Even truth becomes negotiable, because words are tools in a place where every tool can become a weapon. This is what the sword does when it becomes destiny. It attracts ambition the way fire attracts night insects. Everyone wants proximity to the myth. Everyone wants to stand close enough to legitimacy that they can borrow its glow. Everyone wants to be seen as essential to the chosen king, because essential people cannot be discarded easily. And in that glow, a dangerous illusion grows, that the sword can solve problems the king cannot. That if the king holds a legendary blade, he must always be right. That if the symbol is sacred, the man cannot fail. So the blade becomes pressure. And pressure always finds a weak point. This is why the Arthurian world is haunted by betrayal. Not because the world is uniquely cruel, but because symbols invite envy. They invite testing. They invite men to prove, again and again, whether the king deserves what he holds. Some test him because they want the throne. Some test him because they resent that destiny did not choose them. Some test him because they fear the king's power. Some test him because they profit from chaos and cannot survive a united realm. Some test him simply because they cannot tolerate the idea that the world might be fair. And the king is tested in ways a sword cannot cut. He is tested by loyalty that costs too much. He is tested by decisions where every option creates an enemy. He is tested by the temptation to silence pain with force. He is tested by the hunger to be loved when respect would be safer. He is tested by the exhaustion of being watched, because being chosen turns every private moment into a public symbol. Because here is the quiet cruelty of being chosen. People stop asking what the king needs. They ask what the myth demands. They treat the ruler like a tool of destiny rather than a human being who can break. Then comes the enemy no ruler escapes. The idea that the chosen can be replaced. Because when legitimacy comes from a symbol, legitimacy can be stolen, questioned, reinterpreted. The moment someone convinces the court that the sword has turned away, the king becomes just another man holding steel, and other men will challenge him. So whispers begin, doubts that move like smoke, rumors shaped like knives. Every failure becomes evidence. Every delay becomes weakness. Every compromise becomes corruption. Every tragedy becomes proof that the myth is cracking. And slowly, the symbol that created stability becomes the reason stability is fragile. Because symbols don't only unify. Symbols also sharpen competition. The sword creates certainty, and then the world spends the rest of the story trying to destroy that certainty. Not always out of evil. Often out of fear. Fear of living without a sign. Fear of admitting that power is always human, and humans are always imperfect. So the legend darkens, not with one loud twist, but with a slow shadow across a bright hall. The chosen king realizes that being crowned by destiny does not make him free. It makes him watched. And being watched is its own prison. And in that prison, temptation grows. Because a king who is constantly measured begins to crave relief. He begins to crave a moment where he is not the symbol, where he is not the verdict, where he is not the kingdom's fragile hope. He begins to crave ordinary happiness. But ordinary happiness is dangerous for a chosen ruler. Because the myth does not forgive ordinary mistakes. The myth turns them into curses. This is also where the legend becomes complicated in the most interesting way. Because the Arthurian world sometimes carries two blades in one story. A sword that proves legitimacy, and a sword that sustains legitimacy. Some tellings distinguish them. Some merge them. But the symbolic truth remains. The weapon is less important than what people believe it means. A sword in stone is about public proof. It is about the right to rule. But a sword that comes from water, given by a hand that rises from the unknown, is about something older than law. It suggests that the king's authority is not only political. It is spiritual, mythic, bound to forces outside human control. And if authority is bound to forces outside human control, then authority can also be taken away. This is where the sword becomes terrifying, because it stops being a prize. It becomes a lease on legitimacy. So the king holds the blade, but the story reminds him, you do not own this. You are borrowing it. You are being measured by it. And the most haunting part is that the blade is often paired with something people forget to fear, the scabbard. In some versions, the scabbard is the true protection, because it prevents the king from bleeding out, symbolically, from losing stability through slow injury. The blade wins battles, but the scabbard prevents collapse. And that pairing is the legend's quiet moral. People worship the weapon that wins. But survival often depends on the thing that prevents loss. A kingdom loves heroes. A kingdom loves victory. But a kingdom survives because of restraint, law, patience, and the unglamorous choices that prevent the slow bleeding of trust. So the legend warns, if the king grows intoxicated by the blade, by conquest, by spectacle, he will neglect what actually preserves the realm. He will neglect the scabbard, the rules, the codes, the discipline. And when discipline weakens, the kingdom begins to die. Not in one dramatic moment, in a gradual unraveling, in a court that stops believing, in knights who stop trusting each other, in oaths that become optional. Because the moment a vow becomes optional, the round table becomes just furniture, and a sword becomes just steel. And that is why the conflict in this legend feels inevitable, not because the world is determined to destroy the king, but because the symbol demands perfection, and perfection is not human. So the court becomes sharper, oaths become heavier, friendship becomes risk, trust becomes something you ration like food in winter, and the sword, silent, shining, indifferent, remains at the center like a mirror that shows everyone what they want to see, and what they fear to admit. Now we reach the part the legend keeps circling like a hawk, the price, because every great symbol demands payment. A crown demands peace, a kingdom demands innocence, and a sword that chooses demands something sharper than blood. It demands the ruler's humanity. The blade is famous because it is glorious, but glory is what people say from a safe distance. Up close, glory feels like exhaustion. Like nights spent awake while the kingdom sleeps, unaware that one decision can undo years of stability. Like fear you cannot confess, because a chosen king confessing fear sounds like destiny admitting weakness. So what does the sword cost? It costs the king the luxury of being ordinary. He can't make mistakes the way others do. When he fails, his failure becomes proof that destiny was wrong. And people hate destiny being wrong because it means they must face their own responsibility again. That is why courts look for villains. They look for traitors, curses, witches, anything that preserves the illusion that the symbol guarantees perfection. Anything except the simplest truth. No symbol can turn a human into a flawless ruler. And the myth refuses to give the crowd that comfort. Because the myth is not truly about a sword that solves everything. It is about a sword that reveals everything. The blade does not protect the king from consequence. It makes consequence brighter. The moment the king believes the sword exists for his desire rather than the realm's stability, the contract breaks. Not with lightning, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet shift in trust, a hesitation in obedience, a chill in loyalty, a feeling in the room that the myth is no longer holding. And once trust collapses, the sword becomes heavy. Not physically, myth is rarely that literal. It becomes heavy in meaning, heavy in accusation, heavy in regret. A weapon that once felt like destiny begins to feel like evidence. Evidence of what? Evidence that even a chosen king can be dragged into human failure. Because the sword does not erase the oldest problem in leadership, loneliness. A ruler cannot share every fear. A ruler cannot confess every doubt. A ruler cannot admit how tired he is, because tiredness in a king feels like weakness in a kingdom. So the king becomes isolated behind his own symbol. He stands in the center of the court and feels the distance of every stare. People don't look at him like a man. They look at him like a verdict. And in that isolation, cracks spread. Not all cracks are evil. Some cracks are simply human. A friend becomes a rival because rivalry is easier than humility. A noble becomes resentful because obedience tastes like humiliation. A vow becomes burdensome because discipline demands sacrifice, and sacrifice is never comfortable. And then the legend leans toward its darkest truth. A kingdom can be broken not only by enemies. It can be broken by the people closest to the king, because closeness to power is addictive, and addiction makes people betray. Different tellings name different betrayers. Different tellings place the knife in different hands. The story isn't obsessed with one villain. It is obsessed with the idea that betrayal is inevitable when power becomes sacred, because sacred power creates heresy. And heresy always finds followers. So the court that once looked like sunlight begins to feel like weather turning. Knights watch each other longer. Smiles sharpen. Jokes become tests. Small insults become duels. Private grievances become public factions. And the king learns a devastating lesson. A symbol can unify people, yes, but it can also make them compete for proximity to holiness. That competition corrodes loyalty from the inside. And eventually, the legend reaches the moment where the sword must leave. Not because steel failed, because the measure is complete. When the story sends the blade back, often into the lake, returned to the mysterious hand of the Lady of the Lake, it is not merely ending a chapter. It is making a statement about what symbols are supposed to do. A symbol is not meant to be inherited like property. A symbol is meant to test a generation, teach a lesson, and withdraw before people confuse worship with wisdom. So the blade returns to mystery, because mystery is where symbols belong. If symbols stay too long in human hands, humans begin to treat them like tools. And tools are used for desire. The legend refuses to let that happen. It pulls the sword away the moment the lesson becomes undeniable. A kingdom cannot be saved by a weapon. It can only be saved by discipline. And discipline is not a miracle. It is a life. Evidence that the king was never meant to win forever, only to hold the line for a time. Because that is what legends whisper when they are honest. Power is temporary. And the true test is not whether you can claim power. It is whether you can carry it without becoming what your people feared. It is whether you can let it go when letting it go is the only way to save what you built. That is why many versions of the story allow the sword to leave the human world the way it entered, through mystery. Back to water, back to silence, back to the place where symbols are born, beyond the reach of those who want to own them. Because the blade was never property. It was a measure of restraint, a measure of whether a ruler could remain worthy under pressure. And when the measure is complete, the symbol withdraws, as if to say the lesson is finished. Not because the story wants drama, because the story wants truth. A kingdom cannot be saved by a weapon. It can only be saved by discipline. And discipline is not a moment. It is a life. So what is the sword, really? Not just a famous blade. It is the story humanity tells itself when it is desperate for a sign, desperate for certainty, desperate to believe legitimacy can be proven in one impossible moment instead of being earned through 1,000 difficult choices. The blade is a test disguised as a miracle. It offers the kingdom unity, but it demands restraint. It offers the king authority, but it demands discipline. It offers the people comfort, but it demands responsibility. Because symbols are powerful, but symbols are not substitutes for wisdom. This is why Excalibur never truly belonged to the king. It belonged to the idea of kingship. It belonged to the promise that leadership must be more than appetite, more than conquest, more than charisma, more than the ability to make a crowd cheer. Because crowds cheer for spectacle. But spectacle does not feed people in winter. Spectacle does not settle disputes without violence. Spectacle does not repair what betrayal breaks. So the legend keeps insisting, in different costumes and different scenes, that legitimacy is not a moment. It is maintenance. A king must maintain trust the way a city maintains walls, brick by brick, day by day, repairing cracks before they become gates. And if you want the deepest reading of the sword in the stone, it is this: the sword is not proving who deserves power. It is proving who can refuse to abuse power. It is proving who can remain disciplined when discipline is lonely. Because it is easy to be noble when everyone is watching. It is harder to be noble when no one is watching, when you could take what you want and call it destiny. That is why the sword is a test, not a reward. So when you hear the legend, don't only imagine a young man pulling steel from stone. Imagine the years afterward. Imagine the nights of doubt. Imagine the 1,000 moments where the king must choose restraint over appetite, patience over rage, duty over comfort. Because that is what the sword was measuring. And that is why the story survives. It is not about medieval glory. It is about the terrifying simplicity of power. Power reveals who you are. And the strongest weapon in any kingdom is not a blade. It is the discipline to refuse the blade when the blade would be easy. And that is why this legend survives. Not because it's about steel, but because it's about the hunger for certainty and the danger of worshipping it. In every era, people search for a sword in a stone, a proof that someone deserves to lead, a sign that ends argument, a miracle that absolves everyone else from choosing. But the myth warns you, when you hand your responsibility to a symbol, you also hand away your future. You become loyal not to wisdom, but to spectacle. And spectacle is fragile. The moment it fails, the crowd panics, and panic is how kingdoms fall. So remember this, seeker of legends. A true king is not defined by the weapon he holds, but by the temptation he refuses. Not by the miracle that crowned him, but by the discipline that kept him worthy when no one was cheering. And if the blade was truly a test, then its greatest lesson is simple. The hardest part is never claiming the throne. The hardest part is staying worthy of it. So if you are listening to this story in a modern world, the legend is still talking to you. Not about knights, about the hunger for certainty. Every era has its stone. Every era has its crowd. Every era has its desperate wish that a symbol will do the hard work for them. People still want a miracle that chooses for them, because choosing is terrifying. Choosing makes you responsible. Choosing means you can be wrong. Choosing means you might suffer the consequences of your own judgment. So the myth warns, if you hand your responsibility to a symbol, you will eventually be ruled by whoever controls the symbol. And whoever controls the symbol will control your future. That is why Excalibur returns to mystery. It leaves before it can be exploited forever. It withdraws before the kingdom can turn it into propaganda. Because the legend is protecting its own lesson. And its final lesson is not romantic. It is severe. A ruler is not defined by the weapon he holds. He is defined by the temptations he refuses. Remember that, seeker of legends. Because that is what legends whisper when they are honest. Power is temporary. The crowd is fickle. And the true test is not whether you can claim power. It is whether you can carry it without becoming what your people feared. Next Sunday, we leave the courts and the steel behind and enter a world where law is written in vines, shadow, and ancient breath. The jungle has its own guardian, and it has its own price. Remember, every legend was once real.